beautiful, beloved souls. Welcome to my channel. My name is Gem Stone, and I'm a psychic medium, and I am an author. On this channel, you will find I don't fit any particular niche. I look at anything and everything to do with life and death through a lens. I do like to focus on spirituality and the paranormal. I love mysteries. I love alien stuff, conspiracies. And please stay with me until the end, because if you would like to know how to channel or how to remote view, I'm offering PDFs. Now, also, if you want to remote view practice, there are plenty of websites that offer that for free. All right, let's get into the commentary. And I have touched on this topic several times before, but I feel it's very important. Okay, professional mediumship, navigating the psychological need to feel chosen by spirits. There is a particular gravity that surrounds people who claim to be chosen, not merely intuitive, not simply spiritually curious. Chosen by spirits, chosen by extraterrestrials, chosen by angels, chosen by ascended masters, chosen by secret councils hidden behind the curtain of reality. And for some audiences, that claim lands with the force of thunder rolling across a cathedral ceiling. It creates instant authority, instant mystique, instant hierarchy. But in this video, we are stepping into territory that many spiritual communities avoid because it threatens the architecture holding entire identities together. We are asking a dangerous question. When someone says they have been specially selected by invisible beings, are we witnessing genuine contact? Or are we watching the human psyche build a throne out of unmet emotional needs? Because the truth is, the desire to feel spiritually important can become intoxicating. It can become a psychological narcotic wrapped in cosmic language. And this is not limited to uneducated people. Some of the most convincing personalities in spiritual circles are highly intelligent, professionally trained, articulate, charismatic, and deeply read. Intelligence alone does not immunize anyone against self-deception. In some cases, it decorates it. A sophisticated ego is still an ego. And this is where professional discernment begins, not with attacking spiritually, not with mocking intuition, not with reducing every mystical experience to pathology, but by having the courage to examine the shadow that can grow behind spiritual authority. Because true mediumship is not performance art. It is not celebrity culture wearing incense. It is not spiritual aristocracy. A genuine practitioner should become quieter internally over time, not grander. The ego wants a crown. Real service usually hands you a broom. And that distinction matters more than people realize. The autonomy of the chosen narrative. Sorry, sometimes I get a bit tongue-tied. That happens when you live alone and 90% of the time you don't see anyone. Okay, the anatomy of the chosen narrative. Human beings possess a deep psychological hunger to matter. That hunger is ancient. We want our lives to mean something larger than bills, routines, disappointments, aging bodies, unresolved grief, and ordinary mortality. So when someone begins feeling intuitive impressions, synchronicities, vivid dreams, altered states, or emotional sensitivities, the mind naturally attempts to organize those experiences into a story. And the most emotionally rewarding story is often this: I am special, not just sensitive, selected, not just observant, appointed, not just intuitive, cosmically authorized. The psyche loves narratives that elevate identity because identity itself acts like emotional scaffolding. It protects us from insignificance. This does not mean every spiritual experience is false. It means the interpretation of the experience becomes vulnerable to ego inflation. That is the critical distinction many communities fail to make. Someone may genuinely have unusual perceptions while simultaneously building a fantasy structure around those perceptions. A person can experience intuition and still become psychologically seduced by the identity created around it. And once audience becomes involved, the process intensifies dramatically. Attention acts like gasoline. Validation acts like oxygen. Followers become mirrors, reflecting back an increasingly mythologized self-image. Soon, the practitioner is no longer merely interpreting experiences, they are protecting an identity. That is when discernment begins dying. Because the moment your spiritual role becomes emotionally necessary to your self-worth, objectivity begins to evaporate. The human mind is extraordinarily skilled at preserving emotionally rewarding beliefs, especially beliefs that provide importance, certainty, authority, admiration, belonging, protection from existential fear. The chosen identity can function like psychological armor. And here's where things become uncomfortable. Sometimes the spirit world people describe may not be entirely external at all. Sometimes the psyche itself generates symbolic experiences from unconscious material. Dreams, archetypes, emotional wounds, grief, unmet attachment needs, loneliness, trauma, and fantasy can all produce experiences that feel overwhelmingly real. The subconscious is not a cardboard box, it is an ocean trench. And if someone lacks rigorous self-examination, they may begin mistaking internal psychological material for external divine communication. This is why professional discernment requires brutal honesty, not selective honesty, not spiritually flattering honesty, brutal honesty. The ego's favorite costume, spiritual specialness. The ego rarely introduces itself directly. It does not walk into the room wearing a badge saying, "Attention! I seek superiority." It disguises itself in morally attractive clothing. Spirituality becomes one of its favorite wardrobes because spiritual superiority appears cleaner than ordinary superiority. Someone may reject material status while secretly becoming addicted to metaphysical status. Instead of, "I am richer than others," the narrative becomes, "I am more spiritually evolved than others." Different costume, same psychological mechanism. Again, blah, blah, blah. Okay, this is why some practitioners come on, Jem, let's start that again. This is why some practitioners gradually drift from humility into subtle elitism. They begin speaking as though ordinary people are asleep while they themselves are awakened. Questioning them becomes framed as low consciousness. Disagreement becomes interpreted as energetic resistance. Skepticism becomes spiritual immaturity. And suddenly, accountability disappears behind a fog machine of cosmic language. This is dangerous, not because spirituality itself is dangerous, but because unchallenged authority always becomes dangerous eventually. History has demonstrated this repeatedly across religion, politics, cults, ideologies, and social movements. Human beings become psychologically vulnerable when someone claims access to hidden truth unavailable to ordinary people, especially when that person appears emotionally certain. Certainty is hypnotic, but authentic mediumship should actually increase humility, because the deeper one moves into the mysteries of consciousness, the more ambiguity emerges. Real depth usually produces caution, not theoretic omniscience. A mature practitioner becomes increasingly aware of how easily perception can become contaminated by projection, wish fulfillment, confirmation bias, emotional attachment, unconscious symbolism, unresolved trauma, group reinforcement. In other words, the professional medium becomes more skeptical of themselves over time, not less. This is one of the clearest signs of psychological maturity. The shadow side of spiritual authority. Now we move into more serious territory, because once someone adopts the chosen identity publicly, a power imbalance begins forming, and power imbalances alter human behavior. A sitter or client may enter a session emotionally vulnerable, grieving, desperate, frightened, lonely, searching for meaning, terrified of death, seeking guidance. The practitioner now occupies a psychologically elevated role. If the practitioner lacks self-awareness, that position can become intoxicating, even unintentionally, because being perceived as spiritually gifted activates powerful psychological rewards. Come on. You're admired, dependence, emotional control, idolization, authority, reverence. And the danger is not always deliberate manipulation. Sometimes it is unconscious reinforcement. The practitioner begins needing the audience psychologically. The audience begins needing the practitioner emotionally. And together they construct a closed feedback loop where skepticism becomes emotionally threatening to both sides. This is where spiritual communities sometimes drift into cultic dynamics without realizing it. Not necessarily dramatic compounds in the wilderness. Modern cultic structures can look polished, educated, articulate, and socially acceptable. The core mechanism is psychological dependency. When a practitioner simply implies they possess exclusive truth, they are uniquely connected, they have privileges, or they have privileged access to hidden beings, ordinary people cannot understand their mission. They may unintentionally cultivate emotional dependency around their identity, and that can severely damage vulnerable people, especially individuals struggling with grief, trauma, loneliness, or existential fear. A responsible practitioner should empower people psychologically, not absorb their autonomy. True guidance increases someone's capacity to think critically. It should not replace their thinking. When spirituality bypasses personal growth, one of the most fascinating dangers within spiritual communities is what psychologists often call spiritual bypassing. This occurs when spiritual beliefs become escape routes around unresolved emotional work. Instead of confronting insecurity, grief, shame, narcissistic wounds, abandonment, loneliness, identity confusion, the individual constructs a spiritual explanation that protects the ego from discomfort. For example, I'm misunderstood because I'm spiritually advanced. I don't fit in because I'm operating on a higher frequency. People criticize me because dark forces fear my gifts. Notice what happens psychologically. The belief system removes the need for self-examination. Every challenge becomes externalized, and once that pattern forms, growth freezes, because accountability cannot survive inside a worldview where all criticism is interpreted as persecution. Professional discernment requires asking terrifying questions about oneself. Am I projecting? Am I exaggerating? Am I emotionally attached to being perceived as gifted? Am I unconsciously dramatizing experiences? Am I confusing symbolism with literal reality? Am I using spirituality to avoid ordinary psychological pain? Those questions are not anti-spiritual. They are anti-delusion. And there is a difference. Cultivating radical self-discernment. So, how does a practitioner maintain integrity? Through radical self-discernment. Not paranoia, not cynicism, not self-hatred. Discernment. A disciplined practitioner develops the ability to observe their own internal processes almost clinically, like a scientist studying weather patterns like a scientist studying weather patterns inside consciousness. Because intuition arrives through the human nervous system, and the nervous system is influenced by memory, emotion, stress, expectation, fear, fantasy, trauma, desire. This means every intuitive impression must pass through layers of psychological filtration. That is why neutral observation matters so deeply. A mature medium learns to separate what did I actually perceive from what story did my mind build around it. That distinction changes everything. For instance, a symbol may arise internally. A feeling may emerge suddenly. An image may appear vividly. But disciplined practice avoids immediately declaring cosmic certainty. Instead, the practitioner remains observing, measured, grounded, because certainty can contaminate perception. And the more emotionally attached someone becomes to a dramatic interpretation, the harder it becomes to remain objective. That is why some of the best practitioners in any field develop humility through experience. The deeper they go, the more aware they become of complexity. The loudest certainty often belongs to the least examined mind. The discipline of neutral observation. There is a phrase that should probably become central to professional mediumship. Report, don't embellish. That single principle could clean enormous amounts of distortion from spiritual practice. Instead of, I have been chosen by an ancient cosmic council to awaken humanity, neutral observation sounds more like, I experience an internal impression that feels significant to me. Notice the difference. One statement leaves room for interpretation. The other manufactures authority. Neutral observation strips away theoretical glamour. And interestingly, accuracy often improves when ego dramatization decreases. Why? Because emotional inflation introduces noise into perception. Once someone begins performing spiritual identity rather than quietly observing phenomena, the signal becomes contaminated. Professional detachment is not coldness, it is discipline. A surgeon requires steady hands. A pilot requires instrument calibration. A medium should require psychological calibration. Otherwise, personal mythology begins leaking into every interpretation, and eventually the practitioner stops hearing anything clearly because they are trapped inside their own symbolic echo chamber. The danger of audience reinforcement. The internet has intensified this phenomenon enormously. Algorithms reward certainty, drama, and grand narratives. A calm practitioner saying, "I may be mistaken and I encourage critical thinking," rarely goes viral. But someone declaring, "I have direct contact with multi-dimensional councils governing Earth's destiny," can attract enormous attention. Human psychology is magnetized towards mystery and authority, especially during periods of uncertainty. And modern culture is saturated with uncertainty, political instability, technological anxiety, loneliness, economic stress, spiritual disconnection. People crave meaning. That craving can make audiences vulnerable to emotionally compelling narratives presented with confidence. Again, this does not automatically mean every claim is false, but confidence itself is not evidence. A calm uncertainty may actually contain more integrity than dramatic certainty. And professional discernment means learning to tolerate ambiguity instead of rushing to mythology, because ambiguity is psychologically uncomfortable. The ego wants conclusions. Reality often provides fragments. Reclaiming mediumship as a craft. Perhaps one of the healthiest shifts we can make is moving mediumship away from divine status symbolism and back towards disciplined craft. A craft requires practice, humility, correction. Hold on a minute, sorry. Let me repeat it.
This is a reminder.
Sorry about that. I knew that would happen. Let me repeat that. Perhaps one of the healthiest shifts we can make is moving mediumship away from divine status symbolism and back towards disciplined craft. A craft requires practice, humility, correction, ethical standards, self-reflection, accountability, emotional maturity. A craft does not require spiritual celebrity. The most trustworthy practitioners are often the least theatrical. They do not need constant reinforcement that they are cosmically important. They focus on service rather than identity. And ironically, that groundedness often creates greater credibility, because authentic depth tends to feel calmer, less inflated, less desperate for reverence. Real maturity can sit quietly in uncertainty without collapsing psychologically. That is rare and incredibly valuable. Final reflection. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with a challenge, not merely to question others, but to question ourselves. Because the chosen narrative exists on a spectrum inside all human beings. Most people want to feel special somehow, important somehow, seen somehow. That desire is profoundly human. But when spirituality becomes fused with identity hunger, discernment begins dissolving. And once discernment dissolves, fantasy can slowly dress itself as revelation. Professional mediumship, if it is to maintain integrity, requires psychological transparency alongside spiritual openness. Not blind belief, not hostile dismissal. Balance, humility, observation, ethics, and perhaps the most mature sentence a practitioner can say is not, "I know with absolute certainty," but rather, "This is my perception, filtered through my humanity, and I remain willing to question it." That sentence may not create a spiritual empire. It may not generate dramatic mythology, but it protects something far more valuable: integrity. Because true wisdom rarely arrives wearing a crown. More often, it enters quietly, carrying a lantern through fog. Thank you, beautiful, beloved souls. I do have to apologize. I apologize for a couple of things. Apologize for my ALEXA going off and for me stumbling over my words. That tends to happen. I live alone. I rarely see people. I just have a pet dog, so I don't talk much. So your tongue can get lazy. And I always say to my audience, question everything, including me. Okay, back to this. I am not saying I am an expert, but as a psychic medium, I can channel and I can remote view. At best, the best remote viewers are 65% accurate. So, if you would like either PDF, there's the information, there's my email address, there's my PayPal address. I am selling both for $3. Also, if you are not interested, I am not pushing this on anyone. I'm just trying to make a buck like everybody else is. All right. If you are going to leave a comment, please do so respectfully. If only the world was more respectful, more tolerant, wouldn't it be a better place? Please be kind to one another. Smile at a stranger. Costs nothing for a smile, and you may have just saved someone's life. And please take care of yourselves, because you matter. You are precious. You are here for a reason. If you do drop a comment, do so with respect, please. Thanks again for watching, for being here. Love, light, and blessings. See you tomorrow. Bye.